In 1832, workers digging beneath the streets of Quebec City struck something they could not explain. Not rock, not soil, not the roots of old trees. Something else. Something that had no business being there, buried under layers of earth that hadn't been touched in centuries, maybe longer. What they found sent shockwaves through a small circle of colonial scholars, triggered a frantic correspondence between institutions on 2 continents, and then, within a generation, vanished so completely from the historical record that most Canadians today have never heard a single word about it. This is not a story that lives in textbooks. You won't find it on guided tours of old Quebec. It doesn't appear in the commemorative plaques that line the narrow streets of the lower town, where the cobblestones press up against centuries of layered history, like pages in a book no one has bothered to finish reading. What happened in 1832 beneath one of North America's oldest colonial cities has been quietly, methodically, and in some cases deliberately erased from public memory. But the records exist, fragments of them, pieces scattered across archives in Quebec City, Montreal, London, and Paris, and in the private correspondence of men who knew they were sitting on something that could not be easily explained within the comfortable frameworks of their time. Tonight, we are going to follow those fragments. We are going to walk back into 1832, into the mud and the confusion and the shock of that original discovery. We are going to ask the questions that the scholars of that era stopped asking, and we are going to look at what the disappearance of this story tells us about who gets to write history and who gets buried underneath it. If you're watching this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where you right now and what time is it. Quebec City in 1832 was not the polished heritage destination it would eventually become. It was a working city, loud, crowded, straining under the weight of its own rapid expansion. The population had been growing for decades, driven by immigration from the British Isles and by the economic energy of the St. Lawrence trade corridor. Ships moved constantly through the harbor. Timber, fur, grain, and manufactured goods flowing in both directions between the old world and the new. The city was building. Roads, drainage systems, foundations for new structures in both the upper and lower town. And wherever cities build, they dig. The excavation that matters to us began in the late spring of that year. The exact date varies depending on which account you're reading, because the accounts themselves are few and often secondhand, written by people who heard about the discovery days or weeks after it happened. What is consistent across the surviving sources is the location, somewhere in the vicinity of the lower town, in the dense warren of streets and structures that pressed close to the cliffs below the Chateau Frontenac's eventual site. Workers were clearing ground, cutting through compacted earth and rubble. Routine work in a city that had been building on top of itself for 2 centuries. Then they hit something that stopped them cold. The first accounts describe a stone surface where there should have been only earth, not natural bedrock which they would have recognized. This was worked stone dressed in a way that suggested deliberate human shaping. The workers called for supervisors. Supervisors called for the men who handled official correspondence. And the official correspondence, a few letters of which have survived in fragmentary form, describes what was uncovered as the day progressed. There were walls, partial foundations of walls, built from stone that did not match the construction techniques of French colonial Quebec, not the rough rubble masonry of the earliest French buildings, not the dressed limestone typical of the 18th century construction boom. Something older, something that bore a closer resemblance, according to the men who examined it, to the kind of cyclopean stonework that educated Europeans in 1832, associated with ancient Mediterranean civilizations. That comparison was not made lightly. The men writing these letters were not romantic fantasists looking for sensationalism. They were colonial administrators, engineers, and at least one clergyman with scholarly pretensions. They knew what rough colonial stonework looked like. They knew what river-tumbled fieldstone looked like. What they were describing in careful and somewhat bewildered language was neither. The stones were large. Several accounts specified dimensions that, if accurate, would suggest blocks well beyond the capacity of the hand tools available to the earliest French settlers in the region. The joints between the stones were tighter, several observers noted, than what you typically saw in the most careful colonial masonry, and tighter certainly than anything laid down in haste or poverty. One letter, referenced in a later compilation of Quebec antiquarian writings from the 1860s, and apparently no longer directly accessible in any public archive, described geometric markings on several of the stones, not chisel marks left by dressing, not the accidental scoring of tools, deliberate incised patterns. The author of that letter, whose identity is given only as a surveyor employed by the colonial government, said the patterns reminded him of nothing so much as the kind of symbolic markings he had read about in accounts of ancient ruins in the Mediterranean world. That letter, and several others from the same period referencing the same discovery, disappeared from the archive it had reportedly been deposited in some time before the First World War. The compilation that referenced them is itself now extraordinarily rare, with only a handful of copies known to exist in institutional collections. This is how a discovery vanishes, not in a single dramatic act of suppression, in the slow accumulation of lost letters, misfiled documents, and institutional indifference that turns the past into silence. But before we get to the disappearance, we need to stay in 1832 a little longer, because what was found beneath Quebec City did not stay a local secret, at least not immediately. Word reached Montreal. Word reached the colony's intellectual circles, such as they were. And word, eventually, reached certain correspondents in Britain and France who had been paying attention to something much larger than one excavation in a Canadian city. To understand why those European correspondents cared, you need to understand the intellectual climate of 1832. This was a period of tremendous ferment around the question of pre-Columbian North America. The standard narrative, the one taught in schools and enshrined in popular understanding, held that the indigenous peoples of North America were recent arrivals in geological terms, and that before European contact, the continent had seen no complex civilizations, no monumental architecture, no long-distance trade networks of the kind that characterized the Old World's ancient cultures. North America, in this telling, was a blank slate, a wilderness waiting for the pens of European civilization to write something meaningful on it. But the evidence kept pushing back against that story. The mound builders of the Mississippi and Ohio valleys had been attracting intense scholarly attention since the late 18th century. Their earthworks were simply too large, too geometrically precise, too clearly the product of organized labor to be dismissed. The walls at Newark, Ohio, the Great Serpent Mound, the enormous platform mounds at Cahokia, which covered more ground than the Great Pyramid at Giza. These were not the remnants of a simple forager society. Something complex had been happening in North America long before Europeans arrived, and the scholars of 1832 were just beginning to seriously grapple with how complex. Into this intellectual environment came reports of dressed stone foundations beneath Quebec City, stone that predated French settlement, stone that might even predate the indigenous peoples that French settlers had encountered. The implications were not lost on those who received the reports. Quebec City sits on one of the most strategically significant geographic positions in eastern North America. The narrowing of the St. Lawrence River at the Cape of Diamond, where the river squeezes between the north shore and the offshore banks, made it a natural control point for anyone moving between the Atlantic and the interior of the continent. The Haudenosaunee and Algonquin peoples had understood this for centuries before Champlain arrived. Champlain had understood it immediately upon arrival in 1608. The question that the 1832 discovery forced into the open was this: had someone else understood it before all of them? There is a persistent and largely suppressed thread in the archaeology of the St. Lawrence Valley that suggests human occupation of the region goes back in unusual and complex ways that the standard narrative of North American prehistory struggles to accommodate. The river itself is a corridor, a deep, navigable highway running from the Gulf of St. Lawrence deep into the continental interior, connecting to the Great Lakes system and through it to the vast drainage basins of the American heartland. For any seafaring people capable of navigating the North Atlantic, the mouth of the St. Lawrence would have been an unmistakable invitation. The Norse knew this. The saga's record exploration along what is almost certainly the St. Lawrence coast. L'Anse aux Meadows in Newfoundland, confirmed archaeologically as a Norse settlement from around 1000 CE, sits at the entrance to the Gulf of St. Lawrence. The Norse were not the last Europeans to find their way to this coast, and the evidence increasingly suggests they were not the first. Decades before Columbus, Basque fishermen were working the Grand Banks and almost certainly making landfall along the coast. Portuguese expeditions of the early 16th century recorded contacts with peoples and places that suggest considerably more prior exploration than the official history of European discovery acknowledges. But all of that, from the Norse onward, is within a historical framework that most scholars, even skeptical ones, can at least engage with. What the 1832 discovery pointed toward was something potentially much older, something that raised questions not about which European power got to the coast first, but about who was here before any Europeans at all. The stone walls beneath Quebec City were not, according to the surviving accounts, Norse in character. They were not the turf and timber construction of a Viking longhouse, as at L'Anse aux Meadows. They were not the post and beam construction of indigenous longhouses. They were heavy, deliberate stone construction of a kind that has no clear analog in the accepted pre-Columbian archaeology of eastern North America. This is the point where the story gets genuinely difficult, because there are really only three explanations for dressed stone foundations of apparent antiquity beneath Quebec City. The first is that they were colonial-era construction that was simply misidentified or misremembered by the observers. The second is that they were the work of an indigenous civilization, more sophisticated than the standard narrative allows for. The third is that they were evidence of a pre-Columbian contact with a stone-building culture from somewhere else. The colonial-era explanation has problems. The men examining the site in 1832 were familiar with colonial construction. The French had been building in Quebec City since 1608. The British since 1759. 2 centuries of stone construction would have left identifiable signatures, familiar mortar types, recognizable dressing techniques, construction styles that evolved in documented ways. If the foundations had been, say, an early French structure built and then buried by later development, there would have been records. The French colonial administration was meticulous about property and construction records. Some of those records survive. None of them describe foundations in the area that match what was found. The indigenous explanation is the one that the intellectual establishment of 1832 was least equipped to take seriously, and that the intellectual establishment of today perhaps has the most incentive to examine carefully. The peoples of the St. Lawrence Valley in the centuries before European contact had complex societies. The St. Lawrence Iroquoians, a distinct cultural group from both the Haudenosaunee to the south and the various Algonquin groups to the north, built substantial longhouse villages and engaged in sophisticated long-distance trade. Jacques Cartier encountered them at Hochelaga on the site of modern Montreal in 1534 and found a town of wooden structures housing a substantial population. But Hochelaga was gone by the time Champlain arrived in 1608, and the St. Lawrence Iroquoians had disappeared from the historical record in a way that archaeologists and historians have never been able to fully explain. This disappearance of the St. Lawrence Iroquoians is itself one of the stranger, unresolved questions in Canadian history. A substantial, settled people simply vanished from the lower St. Lawrence Valley in the 70 years between Cartier and Champlain, with no clear record of where they went or what happened to them. Disease is the most common explanation, and it is certainly plausible. The epidemics that swept through North America in the wake of European contact were devastating, but the St. Lawrence Iroquoians leave almost no trace in the oral histories of adjacent peoples, which is unusual for a population that was clearly large enough and established enough to build the town that Cartier described. The stone foundations found in 1832, if they predated French contact, would have to be associated either with the St. Lawrence Iroquoians, with some predecessor culture that had been forgotten even by them, or with outsiders. And this is where the story branches in multiple directions at once. There is a body of evidence, small but persistent, suggesting that the northeastern coast of North America was visited by non-Norse European or Mediterranean seafarers at various points in the deep past. Inscriptions that have been found at various sites across New England and Atlantic Canada, most famously the Paddy's Caves complex in New Hampshire, the Monhegan Island inscription, and various petroglyphs and carved stones from Maine to Nova Scotia, have been interpreted by a minority of researchers as Ogham script, Phoenician script, or Libyan Berber writing. The academic mainstream has been largely dismissive of these interpretations, but the minority has not gone away, and the inscriptions themselves have not been satisfactorily explained within the standard framework. In 1832, the men examining the Quebec City foundations had no framework for interpreting what they were looking at. They could describe it. They could compare it to things they knew from the old world. They could send letters to people who might be able to make sense of it. What they could not do was fit it into a coherent story that their institutions were prepared to support. The letters went out. Some came back with cautious interest, others apparently went unanswered, or the responses were lost, and then the workmen filled in the excavation because the city needed its road, and the schedule for completion did not wait for unresolved antiquarian debates. What was underneath Quebec City went back under Quebec City, and the story began its long slide toward silence. The process by which inconvenient history gets buried is rarely dramatic. It does not usually involve shadowy conspiracies or midnight bonfires of documents, though both of those things do occasionally happen. More often it is a quieter and more banal kind of suppression. The right people simply do not pursue the story. The funding for further investigation fails to materialize. The institutional interest lands elsewhere. The individuals who cared most retire, or die, or move on to other things. And the documents, which no one has thought to specifically preserve, end up in the wrong boxes, in the wrong archives, accessible in theory, but invisible in practice. The 1832 discovery followed exactly this pattern. There was a brief window of institutional interest, perhaps 2 or 3 years, during which the right questions were being asked by people with enough access and authority to potentially answer them. Then the window closed. The political situation in Lower Canada was deteriorating rapidly through the 1830s toward the rebellions of 1837 and 1838, which consumed enormous attention and energy in the colonial administration. The scholarly community was small and distracted. The excavation site was built over, and the letters, most of them, ended up wherever letters end up when no one thinks they are important enough to keep. But not all of them. A few survived, embedded in larger collections of correspondence that were preserved for other reasons. A few were copied into notebooks by antiquarians of the following generation who found them interesting enough to transcribe, and one or two found their way into obscure printed compilations that were themselves only barely preserved. From these fragments, a picture can be assembled. It is not a complete picture. It may not even be an accurate one in every detail. Memory is fallible. Transcription introduces errors. The men writing these letters had their own biases and blind spots and agendas, but the fragments, taken together, point consistently towards something that the standard history of Quebec City does not account for. The walls were not the only thing found. This is a detail that appears in only one of the surviving sources, a compiled extract from the 1860s that is itself drawing on an account that cannot now be verified. But it is a striking detail. The account mentions objects recovered from the soil immediately adjacent to the stone foundations, ceramic fragments that the observer described as unlike any indigenous pottery he had encountered in his experience of the colony, and a metal object whose composition was described as neither iron nor copper, but something else, something the writer admitted he could not identify with confidence. Ceramic and metal. Both of those categories are deeply significant in the archaeology of pre-Columbian contact. Pottery styles are one of the primary tools archaeologists use to identify cultural affiliations, because ceramic traditions are remarkably persistent and distinctive. If the ceramics found in 1832 genuinely did not match known St. Lawrence Iroquoian traditions, that is significant. Metal is even more significant, because the indigenous peoples of the St. Lawrence Valley in the pre-contact period were not metal workers in the Old World sense. They worked copper, but cold-hammered native copper, not smelted metal. An object that was neither iron nor copper, and that a colonial observer with access to the full range of Old World metals couldn't identify, is an extraordinary claim. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and the evidence here is anything but extraordinary in the evidentiary sense. It is a second-hand report of a first-hand account that no longer exists, mentioning objects whose current location is unknown or non-existent. This is precisely the kind of evidence that makes serious archaeologists wary, and rightly so. The history of pre-Columbian contact claims is littered with forgeries, misidentifications, wishful thinking, and outright fraud. The Kensington runestone, the Cardiff giant, the supposed Roman coins found at various sites across North America, most of which turn out to have prosaic explanations on close examination. Caution is warranted, but caution is not the same as dismissal. And the pattern of what happened to the 1832 discovery, the quick burial of the site, the disappearance of the primary documents, the failure of institutional follow-up, is a pattern that looks less like the normal treatment of an insignificant find and more like the normal treatment of a find that made important people uncomfortable. Who would have been made uncomfortable? Let us think about that carefully, because it is one of the more interesting questions this story raises. In 1832, the prevailing colonial ideology in British North America rested on a particular story about the relationship between European civilization and the North American continent. The continent was, in this story, terra nullius in the deepest sense, not just legally empty of sovereign claims that Europeans were required to respect, but culturally empty, historically empty, empty of the kind of deep human achievement that would require Europeans to reckon with North America as a place that had its own complex past. Indigenous peoples were acknowledged to exist, of course, but they were placed in the colonial imagination outside of history in a kind of permanent prehistorical present that made their land appropriable and their cultures dismissible. A discovery of pre-colonial, pre-contact stone architecture beneath one of the oldest European settlements in Canada would have complicated this story in multiple ways. If the architecture was indigenous, it would have suggested a level of cultural sophistication, specifically the capacity for large-scale organized stone construction that the colonial narrative categorically denied. If the architecture was the work of pre-Columbian visitors from somewhere else, it would have raised even more uncomfortable questions about priority, about who had discovered what, and about the whole conceptual architecture of European claims to have brought civilization to an empty land. Neither of those implications was comfortable for the colonial administration of 1832. Neither of them was comfortable for the Church, which had its own stake in a particular narrative of human history. Neither of them was comfortable for the emerging Canadian identity, which was building itself partly on a story of European primacy that a pre-colonial stone city beneath Quebec would have seriously disturbed. This is not to say that anyone sat down in 1832 and made a deliberate decision to suppress the discovery. It is more subtle than that and more insidious. The suppression happened because the people in positions to act on the discovery had no incentive to do so, and multiple incentives not to. The safe choice was to fill in the hole, file the letters in the general correspondence, and move on. And that is almost certainly what happened. But the story did not die entirely. It went underground, which in retrospect seems appropriate, and it surfaced periodically in the following century in ways that kept it alive, even as they kept it marginal. The antiquarian tradition in Quebec in the latter half of the 19th century was robust, but eccentric. There were men, and they were almost exclusively men, who spent their leisure hours poking through old records, corresponding with each other about anomalous finds, and publishing in small journals with limited circulation. These men knew the 1832 story, or versions of it. References to it appear in their correspondence, and occasionally in print, always framed cautiously, always attributed to sources that the writer acknowledges he cannot independently verify. The story circulates, but it circulates in the margins, in the footnotes, there are those who say constructions that allow a writer to float an idea without fully endorsing it. One of the more interesting surfacings of the story comes from the 1890s, when a Quebec historian named Philippe Aubert de Gaspé, the younger, son of the more famous novelist, published a short piece in a local historical review describing what he called the anomalous foundations of 1832. He had apparently spoken with elderly men who had heard accounts of the discovery from people who were present at the time. His account adds a detail that does not appear in the earlier sources, that the walls, when partially cleared, were found to form a recognizable structure, a room or a series of rooms, rather than simply a running foundation line. The stones of the floor, he wrote, were smooth, in a way that suggested long use rather than recent dressing. Smooth stones, worn by feet, worn by the passage of time and human bodies moving across them, repeatedly over a period long enough to leave a visible mark. This detail, if accurate, implies occupation, not just construction, but habitation. Someone lived in those rooms for long enough that the floor showed it. Aubert de Gaspé's article attracted some local interest, but no academic follow-up. By the 1890s, the professionalization of archaeology was underway in North America, and the standards of evidence that the emerging discipline required were ones that stories like this simply could not meet. Without the physical site, without the objects, without anything more than layered oral tradition passing through educated but non-expert intermediaries, there was nothing for a professional archaeologist to do with the 1832 discovery except note it as an unverifiable local legend. This is the trap that stories like this fall into once the critical window for investigation closes. The evidence degrades over time. The first-hand accounts become second-hand and then third-hand. The physical evidence, if it was ever accessible, is sealed under buildings and roads, and the professional standards that might lend the story credibility are the same standards that the story, in its current form, cannot satisfy. Quebec City itself is a city built on layers. Anyone who has spent time in the lower town, in the dense historic core that UNESCO has protected as a World Heritage Site, understands intuitively that there is a great deal of buried history under those streets. The city has been excavated in fragments over the decades, wherever construction or restoration work has required digging down. Some of those excavations have produced genuinely surprising results. In the 1970s, archaeological work in advance of urban renewal in the lower town revealed construction sequences that pushed the human use of the site back much further than the official founding date of 1608. This was not surprising in itself. Indigenous peoples had been using the Cape of Diamond and the surrounding riverbanks for thousands of years before Champlain arrived. But some of what was found did not fit easily into the standard picture of indigenous land use in the region. Stone alignments, modified natural features, evidence of repeated, intensive occupation going back into the deep pre-contact past. These finds were published in technical archaeological reports that circulated within the discipline and were not publicized widely. This is not necessarily sinister. Technical archaeological reports are almost never publicized widely, but it means that the picture of what is underneath Quebec City is considerably more complex than the tourist narrative suggests, and that the 1832 discovery, even if it cannot be verified, does not exist in a historical vacuum. The St. Lawrence River itself holds secrets. The archaeology of the river bottom has been conducted only sporadically and with significant technical challenges. What surveys have been done suggest that the pre-contact landscape of the riverbanks was dramatically different from what exists today. The river level has changed. Significant areas of former land surface now lie underwater. Structures that might once have been visible or accessible on the river's edge could now be submerged and invisible. This matters because the most significant pre-contact sites in the St. Lawrence Valley are almost all on or very near the riverbank, for the obvious reason that the river was the highway. A culture using the St. Lawrence as a transportation corridor would have built at the water's edge. And the water's edge of 1,000 years ago, or 2,000 years ago, is in many places not where the water is today. There is a phenomenon that archaeologists working in coastal and riverine environments have come to call sea level archaeology, the systematic investigation of sites that have been submerged by rising water since their occupation. This approach has yielded extraordinary results in places like the North Sea, where entire submerged landscapes of Mesolithic occupation have been mapped on the seafloor between Britain and Denmark. Similar approaches have been applied in Scandinavia, in Australia, and increasingly along the Atlantic coast of North America. The St. Lawrence Valley has seen almost none of this kind of systematic investigation, partly for reasons of resources and priority, and partly, one suspects, because of the profound institutional reluctance to find things that would require revising the standard story. Let us come back to the specific question of who might have built what was found in 1832. Setting aside for the moment the question of whether the discovery was genuine, assuming the accounts are broadly accurate, what could it have been? The St. Lawrence Iroquoians are the most obvious candidate. They were a stone-using culture, though primarily for tools rather than architecture. They did build substantial structures, but in wood, following the architectural traditions of the northeastern woodlands. There are no confirmed examples of St. Lawrence Iroquoian stone construction of the kind described in the 1832 accounts. This does not rule them out absolutely, because the absence of known examples may simply reflect how little of their material culture has survived and been found. But it creates a difficulty. More speculative, but more consistent with the described construction, is the possibility of a Dorset culture presence. The Dorset were the pre-Inuit inhabitants of the eastern Arctic and subarctic, including Newfoundland and possibly the northern St. Lawrence region. They did build in stone, constructing low stone houses and hearths that have been found at numerous sites across their range. They were present in the region during a period, roughly 500 BCE to 1000 CE, that overlaps with one of the more active phases of transatlantic contact in the North Atlantic. The Dorset and the Norse interacted, or at least coexisted, in the eastern Arctic, and the Dorset Range, at its southern extent, included areas of Newfoundland and possibly the Gulf of St. Lawrence. A Dorset presence at the site of modern Quebec City would be pushing the known boundary of their range considerably southward. But the known boundary of their range is defined by where archaeology has looked and found things, not necessarily by where they actually went. The St. Lawrence was a navigable corridor. The Dorset were capable maritime travelers. There is no compelling geographical reason they could not have reached the Cape of Diamond. But there is another candidate that the scholarship of 1832 would have considered, and that the scholarship of today is largely prohibited from considering by the professional stigma attached to it: pre-Columbian transoceanic contact. The idea that peoples from the Old World reached the Americas before Columbus is not in itself a fringe idea. It is settled fact for the Norse case. L'Anse aux Meadows is dated and confirmed and accepted. The debate is about scale and frequency and what these contacts meant. The conventional view is that Norse contact was brief, unsuccessful in terms of sustained settlement, and had no significant impact on the indigenous peoples of North America. The unconventional view, which a minority of serious researchers have advocated and which the evidence periodically supports in ways that are difficult to dismiss, is that contact was more extensive, more sustained, and more consequential than the conventional account allows. The Smithsonian Institution, not usually a hotbed of radical revisionism, has in recent years acknowledged that the question of pre-Columbian contact is more open than it was previously thought to be. Genetic studies of indigenous North American populations have found traces of genetic material that is best explained by contact with populations from South America, East Asia, and in some analyses, populations with affinities to Northern European groups, all before Columbus. These findings are contested and their interpretation is actively debated, but they exist, and they cannot be made to go away simply by insisting that they do not fit the standard model. The standard model has another problem. It is built largely on absence. We know that certain kinds of contact did not leave unambiguous physical evidence in the archaeological record. We take this absence of evidence as evidence of absence. But the pre-Columbian period along the Atlantic coast of North America is extraordinarily poorly sampled archaeologically. The coastal sites that would be most relevant, the landing points, the temporary camps, the possible trading stations, are overwhelmingly submerged or eroded away. What little has been found has often been misattributed or dismissed. The record we have is not a representative sample of what was there. It is the tiny residue that happened to survive in conditions that allowed recovery and recognition. Into this context, the 1832 discovery fits with uncomfortable precision. Not because it proves pre-Columbian contact, it does not prove anything of the kind, but because it represents exactly the sort of evidence that would be expected if pre-Columbian contact occurred and left physical traces. and exactly the sort of evidence that would disappear from the record given the institutional dynamics of colonial North American scholarship. There is a researcher working in the 1950s and 1960s at Laval University in Quebec City, whose name appears occasionally in the footnotes of papers on St. Lawrence Valley, Archaeology, and who reportedly spent years attempting to reconstruct the documentary record of the 1832 discovery. His name was Gilles Morin-Leclerc, a name that requires some explanation, because he was not an archaeologist by training, but a historian of colonial administration who came across references to the discovery while working on an entirely unrelated project on the development of Quebec City's infrastructure in the 19th century. Morin-Leclerc followed the references where he could. He found some of the letters. He found the Aubert de Gaspé article. He found references in other antiquarian compilations that pointed back to primary sources he could not locate. He wrote up his findings in a long memorandum that he circulated to colleagues in the history and archaeology departments at Laval, suggesting that a systematic archival search might be warranted and that the story deserves serious attention. The response, according to accounts from people who knew Morin-Leclerc and were interviewed by a journalist doing a piece on Quebec, historical mysteries in the late 1970s, was polite indifference. The archaeologists felt the story was too thinly documented to pursue. The historians felt it was outside their competence. The administration had no particular interest in funding what would have been a speculative archival project with no guaranteed outcome. Morin-Leclerc died in 1971, and his own papers, including the memorandum and whatever notes he had accumulated on the 1832 discovery, went to Laval's archives. They are technically accessible, but they are not indexed in any way that would make them visible to a researcher who did not know specifically what to look for. They exist, but in the same way that a book exists on the wrong shelf in a library with no catalog. Theoretically retrievable, practically lost. This is the status of the 1832 discovery as of today. Not definitively proven false, not definitively proven true. Existing in the liminal space between documented history and oral tradition, supported by fragmentary evidence that points towards something real, while never quite constituting proof of anything specific. But the geography speaks even when the documents fall silent. Consider where Quebec City sits. The Cape of Diamond is, from the perspective of anyone navigating the St. Lawrence, one of the most conspicuous and significant landmarks on the river. The cape rises abruptly from the river level, creating a natural elevated position that commands a view up and down the river for many kilometers in both directions. This is not just a good place to build a city from a colonial European perspective. It is a good place to build anything from the perspective of anyone who has ever needed to watch a river, to control access to a river, to signal to approaching vessels, or simply to make a structure that will last against the elements. The Cape is defensible, visible, and permanent. It is the kind of place that human beings, regardless of culture or era, tend to build things on when they have the technology and the organization to do so. This point was noted by Champlain himself, who chose the location for its obvious strategic advantages. It had been used for similar reasons by the St. Lawrence Iroquoians before him, whose village of Stadacona occupied the general area, and the Algonquin peoples before the Iroquoians would have recognized the significance of the site. The question is how far back that recognition of significance goes, and whether any of the occupants before Champlain had the inclination and the capacity to build in stone. The bones of the cape itself are limestone, sedimentary rock that is workable with the right tools, and that has been used for construction by every culture that has ever had access to it and the organizational capacity to quarry and move it. The French built in limestone, the British built in limestone. The stone underlying Quebec City's historic fortifications is the same stone that would have been available to any earlier occupant of the site, assuming the inclination to use it and the knowledge of how to do so. A people capable of quarrying and dressing limestone, of building walls and floors that could survive centuries of burial under subsequent occupation, would leave exactly the kind of traces described in the 1832 accounts. The question is, which people and when? Here is a thread worth pulling. In the oral traditions of various indigenous nations of the northeastern woodlands, there are persistent references to the people who came before, to structures and places that predate the remembered past of the community, to ruins and foundations that elders point to as evidence of an older civilization. These oral traditions were not taken seriously by colonial scholars who dismissed them as mythology. They are beginning to be taken more seriously now, as the archaeology of the region reveals increasing evidence of complexity and depth in the pre-contact past. The Abenaki, whose traditional territory included much of what is now Quebec and the maritime provinces, have oral traditions that reference stone structures built by people who were not the Abenaki themselves, people who came from the water, who built in a way that the Abenaki did not, who were there before living memory, and who left behind their stone as a marker of their passage. These traditions were recorded by missionaries and colonial administrators in the 17th and 18th centuries, typically in contexts where the recorder was looking for information about potential trading partners or rival powers, not for evidence of deep pre-contact archaeology. But the traditions exist. The Mi'kmaq to the east have similar traditions, referencing older peoples and structures, particularly along the Atlantic coast. The Haudenosaunee oral history contains references to periods of conflict and migration that their historians associate with large-scale disruptions to the regional population structure, disruptions that may correlate with the disappearance of the St. Lawrence Iroquoians and with changes in the archaeological record that have never been satisfactorily explained. None of this constitutes proof of anything specific. Oral traditions are evidence of a kind, but they require careful interpretation and are subject to the same problems of transmission and bias that affect documentary evidence. They can preserve genuine memory of past events. They can also incorporate mythological elements, borrowed narratives, and later additions in ways that are difficult to disentangle from any genuine historical core. The researcher who takes them too literally makes one kind of error. The researcher who dismisses them entirely makes another. The reasonable position is to hold them as data points, as signals that something significant may have happened in the pre-contact past of the region, signals that deserve to be taken seriously in conjunction with the physical and documentary evidence that exists. And when you lay the oral traditions alongside the fragmentary documentary record of the 1832 discovery, alongside the anomalous archaeological findings from later excavations in Quebec City, alongside the broader picture of pre-contact complexity that is emerging from the archaeology of the St. Lawrence Valley as a whole, you get something that begins to look less like the random noise of wishful thinking and more like the consistent silhouette of a suppressed history. The suppression has not been total. It never is. History is like water. It finds the cracks and it moves through them, slowly, persistently, in ways that no administrative decree or institutional indifference can entirely stop. The story of what was found in 1832 has continued to circulate in whispered conversations among local historians, in occasional articles in regional publications, in the kind of late-night conversations that happen when people who have been digging in. Archives compare notes. There is a local tradition in Quebec City, old enough that no one can identify its origin, of pointing to certain sections of the lower town walls and saying that what you are seeing is not entirely what the official plaques say it is. Tour guides do not repeat this tradition. It does not appear in official heritage materials. But residents of the old city have been making this observation for a long time, and when you ask them to be more specific, they point to sections of wall where the stone is notably different from the surrounding construction, darker in color, more tightly fitted, without the mortar that characterizes French colonial masonry. Whether this observation reflects genuine architectural anomaly or simply the natural variability in construction technique across different periods of French and British colonial building is impossible to say without systematic investigation. But it is the kind of detail that accumulates around a suppressed story, the fragments of oral memory that survive when the documents have been lost or scattered. The underground river of this discovery continued to flow, even in the later 20th century, in unexpected ways. In the early 1980s, a team of archaeologists conducting routine salvage excavation ahead of utility work in the lower town encountered what their field report describes as anomalous stone configurations at depth inconsistent with known French colonial construction sequences. The report is filed in the archives of Parks Canada's Quebec City office and is technically available under Access to Information, though it requires knowing specifically what to request. The report does not draw any dramatic conclusions. It notes the anomaly, describes it briefly, and recommends further investigation should the opportunity arise. The opportunity did not arise. The utility work proceeded. The anomaly was documented only in the brief field report and whatever photographs were taken, and the follow-up investigation was never funded. One of the archaeologists on that 1980s team, now retired and living in the eastern townships, has spoken on several occasions to local history enthusiasts about what she saw during that excavation. Her account matches, in its broad outlines, what the 1832 documents describe: stone that did not fit the expected construction sequence, joining that was tighter than what French colonial masons typically achieved, and a surface at depth that bore evidence of long use rather than recent construction. She is careful to say that she does not know what it was. She does not claim it was pre-colonial. She simply says it was anomalous, and that the anomaly deserved more attention than it received. This retired archaeologist represents a type that appears repeatedly in the history of suppressed or marginalized archaeological discoveries. The professional who saw something that did not fit, who reported it through proper channels, and who watched it get filed and forgotten. She did not lose her career over it. She did not make it the center of her professional identity. She simply noted it, recommended follow-up, moved on to the next project, and has spent the intervening decades periodically wondering what it was. This is how suppressed history works in practice. Not in dramatic whistleblower moments, but in the quiet accumulation of unremarkable decisions to not pursue, not fund, not publicize. Each individual decision is defensible. Resources are limited. Evidence is thin. Other priorities are pressing. But the cumulative effect of 100 such decisions is the same as deliberate suppression. The story disappears from the accessible record. Quebec City has been extensively excavated in the areas where urban renewal and infrastructure projects have required it. These excavations have produced a rich picture of the city's colonial past. The material culture of the French regime, of the British colonial period, of the early Canadian period after Confederation, is documented in detail. What is documented in much less detail is anything that predates 1608, the year Champlain established his trading post. This is partly a function of where archaeology has been conducted. Salvage archaeology focuses on areas of new construction, and new construction in Quebec City's historic core has been limited by heritage protection regulations since the 1970s. The areas that have been excavated most thoroughly are not necessarily the areas where pre-colonial deposits are most likely to be preserved, and the areas where pre-colonial deposits might be most significant specifically the areas closest to the river, have been most dramatically altered by subsequent development, much of which occurred in the 19th century when awareness of and concern for pre-colonial archaeology was essentially non-existent. The lower town has been built and rebuilt multiple times. The shoreline has been extended into the river by successive landfill operations. The cliff face has been cut back, reinforced, and modified. The original landscape of the Cape of Diamond, as it existed before Champlain, has been so thoroughly altered that recovering it, even in imagination, requires significant reconstruction. The buried foundations of 1832, if they survive, are somewhere under all of that subsequent layering, probably inaccessible without the kind of large-scale excavation that neither the budget nor the heritage protection regime of the current city makes practical. But inaccessibility is not impossibility. Ground-penetrating radar and other non-invasive geophysical survey techniques have advanced remarkably in the past 2 decades. It is now possible, in principle, to conduct detailed subsurface survey of an urban area without breaking the surface, and to produce maps of buried features that can guide targeted excavation when conditions allow. This kind of survey has been conducted at Stonehenge, at Roman sites across Britain, at Mayan sites in Central America. It has not, to any significant degree, been conducted beneath the historic core of Quebec City. Why not? The answer is partly financial, partly logistical, and partly a matter of institutional priority. But it is also, at least in the view of some who have advocated for exactly this kind of survey, a matter of institutional reluctance to find things that would be difficult to explain. This charge is difficult to substantiate because the people making decisions about archaeological research priorities do not typically write memos explaining that they are avoiding inconvenient discoveries. But the pattern of where investigation has and has not occurred in Quebec City is consistent with a systematic avoidance of the areas and depths that would be most likely to yield pre-colonial anomalies. This is circumstantial. Everything in this story is, at some level, circumstantial. But circumstantial evidence, when it accumulates in consistent patterns from multiple independent sources over a period of nearly 2 centuries, begins to carry its own kind of weight. Consider the timeline again. 1832. Discovery of anomalous stone foundations, brief documentary record, prompt burial of site. 1860s. Compilation of antiquarian sources referencing the discovery, original documents already largely inaccessible. 1890s. Aubert de Gaspé adds oral history layer, no institutional follow-up. Early 20th century, primary documents referenced in 1860s compilation disappear from archives. 1950s, 1960s, Morin Leclerc attempts systematic reconstruction of documentary record, encounters polite institutional indifference, dies without completing the project. 1980s, salvage excavation produces new anomalous findings, field report filed, no follow-up. Present day, story exists in local oral tradition, scattered published references, and fragmentary archival sources, but no systematic investigation. At each stage, the window for decisive investigation was brief and was not used. At each stage, the institutional response was the same. Acknowledge, file, move on. The result, 2 centuries on, is a story that is neither confirmed nor refuted, but simply suspended in the amber of insufficient evidence. Let us talk about what would be needed to move this story out of suspension. The most direct path would be archival. A systematic search of the relevant archives, specifically the colonial administration records of Lower Canada from 1830 to 1840, the private correspondence of the individuals who would most likely have been involved in or informed about a significant discovery in Quebec City's Lower Town in 1832, and the holdings of institutions in Britain and France that would have been recipients of colonial correspondence in this period. This search would require resources because large colonial archives do not index themselves at the level of detail necessary to find references to a specific local discovery. It would require the right kind of expertise, someone who knows not just the formal institutional records, but the informal correspondence networks of colonial scholarship in the 1830s. And it would require, frankly, the willingness to spend a significant amount of time looking for something that may not be there. But the archival path is not the only one. The physical evidence, if it survives, is in the ground. Ground-penetrating radar survey of the relevant sections of the lower town would be technically feasible and would not require disturbing the surface. If anomalous subsurface features consistent with the described foundations are detected, the case for targeted excavation becomes much stronger. And if the features are there and can be excavated, the questions of dating and cultural affiliation can be addressed with modern scientific tools that were not available in 1832. Radiocarbon dating can establish when organic material associated with the features was deposited. Optically stimulated luminescence dating can establish when sediments were last exposed to light, which can date the burial of the features even without organic material. Ceramic analysis, if any ceramics are found associated with the features, can establish their technological tradition with considerable precision. Metal analysis, if any metal objects are recovered, can establish their composition and in some cases their source. These are not exotic techniques. They are the standard toolkit of modern archaeology. What has been missing in the case of the 1832 discovery is not the technical capacity to investigate it. What has been missing is the institutional will. There is something philosophically important about the way this story has been treated that goes beyond the specific question of what is under Quebec City. It touches on a fundamental question about how we, as a society, decide what gets investigated and what gets left alone, what histories get told and what histories get silenced, and whose knowledge counts as knowledge. The story of the 1832 discovery has survived in the margins because the people who carried it were not the people with institutional power. Elderly residents remembering what their grandparents told them. Antiquarians with limited access to mainstream academic publishing. A retired historian's uncatalogued papers in a university archive. These are the keepers of the story, not the institutions. This is not unique to the Quebec discovery. It is the characteristic pattern of suppressed or marginalized history everywhere. The official record reflects the priorities of those who have the power to make and preserve records. The knowledge that falls outside those priorities survives in the places where official power does not reach, in community memory, in private correspondence, in the careful notebooks of people who cared about something that the institutions did not. The indigenous oral traditions of the northeastern woodlands have preserved knowledge of the pre-contact past in exactly this way. Generations of colonial scholars dismiss them as myth. A generation of more careful scholars has begun to demonstrate that they contain genuine historical information encoded in narrative form. The same principle applies to the fragmentary documentary record of the 1832 discovery. It is not proof, but it is not nothing. And the question of whether it deserves serious investigation is a question that says something about what we value as a society. We are, right now, in a moment of genuine rethinking about the pre-Columbian history of North America. The standard narrative, the one that held that indigenous North Americans were isolated, that their civilizations were limited in complexity, that nothing of historical significance happened on this continent before European arrival, is being revised from multiple directions at once. The archaeology of Cahokia, the evidence for large-scale indigenous landscape management across the Amazon basin, the genetic evidence for complex pre-Columbian population movements, the dating of early human arrival in the Americas, now being pushed back significantly further than the Clovis first hypothesis allowed. All of these revisions are forcing a rethinking of what was possible, what was happening, and who was here. In this context, the 1832 discovery deserves a place in the conversation, not as settled fact, but as a genuine historical question that has been prematurely closed. The story of what was found and the story of how it was lost both deserve investigation, because the second story, the story of how knowledge disappears, is in some ways more important than the first. Understanding how inconvenient histories get buried helps us avoid burying more of them in the future. Quebec City is a living city. It is also an extraordinarily layered one. People have been living on and around the Cape of Diamond for thousands of years, and the accumulated traces of all those lives are there, somewhere, beneath the cobblestones and the heritage buildings and the tourist infrastructure. Most of those traces will never be excavated. The city cannot stop its own functioning to become an archaeological site, but some of them might be accessible with the right methods and the right institutional will. The question of what is down there is not just an academic question. It is a question about identity, about what we are willing to know about our past, about whether we are ready to accept a North American history that is more complex, more ancient, and more surprising than the one we were taught in school. The discovery of 1832 may or may not have been what the fragmentary accounts suggest. The foundations may have a prosaic explanation that no one has been in a position to demonstrate because no one has been in a position to excavate them. The objects described in the most detailed accounts may have been misidentified, or the accounts may have been garbled in transmission, or they may have been accurate descriptions of something genuinely anomalous. We do not know. We cannot know, given the current state of the evidence. What we can say is that the story has been insufficiently investigated, that the investigation that did occur was not followed up with the rigor that the findings warranted, and that the pattern of indifference and avoidance that has characterized the institutional response to the story is consistent with the treatment of discoveries that challenge comfortable historical narratives. Quebec City sits on a mystery, not the romantic mystery of tourist brochures, not the carefully managed mystery of heritage tourism, but a genuine historical mystery whose resolution might require us to rethink significant portions of what we believe about the human past in North America. The workers who struck those stones in 1832 stopped and looked at what they had found. They called their supervisors. They wrote letters. They were in the way of people confronted with something genuinely unexpected, trying to tell a story that their world was not ready to hear. 2 centuries later, we might be closer to being ready. The St. Lawrence River continues to flow. The Cape of Diamond continues to rise above the lower town. And somewhere beneath the cobblestones and the foundations and the accumulated weight of centuries of subsequent history, the stones that were found and then lost again continue to sit in their ancient silence, waiting for the question that has not yet been asked with sufficient seriousness. Or perhaps they are waiting for us to decide that the question is worth asking at all. The answer, when it comes, will tell us something not just about the deep past of one Canadian city. It will tell us something about ourselves, about what we are willing to know, about the histories we choose to honor and the histories we choose to bury. And it may turn out that the most important story about what was found beneath Quebec City in 1832 is not what was there. It is what its disappearance reveals about us. Quebec City holds its silence. The river holds its silence. And the silence, as it always does with buried things, continues to speak. But let us return to something that has been hovering at the edge of this story without being fully addressed. The objects, the ceramic fragments, and the unidentified metal object mentioned in the 1860s compilation are the most tantalizing details in the entire documentary record of the 1832 discovery, and they are also the most problematic. They are the detail most likely to be embellished, most likely to have accumulated interpretive weight that was not there in the original observation, and most likely to have been shaped by the romantic assumptions of whoever was doing the transcribing and compiling. But they are also the detail that, if accurate, would be most definitively diagnostic. Ceramics and metal are the two categories of material culture that archaeologists can most reliably use to establish cultural affiliation, technological tradition, and chronological placement. If the ceramic fragments found in 1832 were genuinely unlike any known indigenous St. Lawrence Valley pottery, and if the metal object was genuinely of a composition unfamiliar to educated colonial observers, those would be extraordinary data points. The question is whether they survive anywhere. Objects recovered from construction excavations in the 19th century did not routinely find their way into institutional collections. Archaeological sensibility was not yet a cultural norm. Interesting finds from building projects were sometimes kept by the workers who found them, sometimes passed along to curious employers or supervisors, sometimes simply discarded. The fate of objects from the 1832 excavation is unknown. No museum collection has been publicly identified as holding material from that site. However, museum collections are not always fully catalogued. The backrooms of institutional collections, even major ones, contain enormous quantities of material that has never been systematically described or made accessible. Provincial and municipal collections are especially likely to have uncatalogued material from the 19th century, when donations were accepted without rigorous documentation. It is not impossible that objects from the 1832 excavation, if they were preserved at all, ended up in a collection somewhere and are sitting in storage under a label that reads simply Stone Age Artifacts, Quebec Region, Donor Unknown. This is where a systematic investigation would need to go. Not just the archives, but the museum storerooms. Not just the published record, but the acquisition registers of institutions that were receiving donations of curious objects from colonial Quebec in the 1830s and 1840s. The Musée de la Civilisation in Quebec City, the Musée McCord in Montreal, the Canadian Museum of History in Gatineau, the British Museum, and the Ashmolean in Britain, both of which received colonial donations from across the empire during this period. Any of these institutions might theoretically hold material from the 1832 excavation without knowing it. The probability of finding such material is not high. Objects that were not carefully documented at the time of recovery are notoriously difficult to trace back to their original context. Even if a ceramic fragment from the Quebec City excavation is sitting in a museum storeroom right now, the connection to the 1832 discovery cannot be made without the documentation that was almost certainly never created. What would remain is an anomalous object in a collection, attributed to a vague regional provenance, whose significance cannot be determined without further investigation of the kind that uncatalogued storeroom material rarely receives. But the possibility is not zero, and in a story where so much has already been lost, even a small possibility is worth noting. The question of the metal object is, if anything, more interesting than the ceramics. The observer who described it as neither iron nor copper was, by all indications, a man with practical familiarity with the common metals of his era. Iron and copper were the two metals most commonly encountered in colonial North America. Iron in the form of tools, nails, hardware, and weapons. Copper in the form of indigenous craft objects and some European trade goods. A colonial surveyor in 1832 would have had extensive experience with both, and his description of the object as neither is, if taken at face value, genuinely puzzling. What metals were available to pre-Columbian cultures that would not have been immediately recognizable to a colonial observer? Bronze is one possibility. Bronze was the dominant metal of Old World civilizations from roughly 3000 BCE to 1000 BCE, and it has a distinctive color and quality quite different from either iron or copper alone. An alloy of copper and tin, bronze does not occur naturally and requires deliberate smelting technology. Indigenous North American cultures did not, as far as current knowledge extends, smelt metals. They worked cold hammered native copper, which is recognizably similar in color to commercially processed copper, but with different physical properties. If the 1832 object was bronze, it would be extraordinary. Bronze in a pre-contact North American context would imply either direct contact with an Old World bronze-using culture or an indigenous metallurgical tradition that the standard account of North American archaeology does not recognize. Either interpretation is significant. Either interpretation would explain why colonial observers in 1832 found the object puzzling and why subsequent scholarship found the account uncomfortable. There are other metals that might fit the description. Tin, pure tin, is a silvery white metal quite distinct from iron or copper. Lead is dense and gray. Zinc, which forms the copper alloy brass and also occurs in some natural mineral forms, might have been confusing to an observer unfamiliar with it in its elemental form. Any of these in an unusual alloy or in an unfamiliar form might have given a colonial observer pause. The most exotic possibility, the one that appears in the more speculative literature on pre-Columbian contact, is meteoric iron. Meteoric iron is an iron-nickel alloy that occurs in some meteorites and that was used for tool making by various ancient cultures that did not have access to smelted iron. The Inuit and some Arctic peoples worked meteoric iron. The ancient Egyptians used it before their iron smelting industry developed. Meteoric iron has a distinctive appearance and composition, notably its nickel content, that sets it apart from both smelted iron and from naturally occurring iron ore. A colonial observer familiar with smelted iron might not immediately recognize meteoric iron as a form of the same metal. None of this is more than speculation about the nature of an object that no longer exists, or cannot be identified if it does exist. But the speculation is not entirely idle. It illustrates the range of possibilities that a genuine pre-colonial object might represent, and it underlines why the account of an unidentified metal object is so frustratingly tantalizing. If the object could be found and analyzed with modern techniques, it could potentially resolve the question of the discovery's cultural context definitively. The certainty of never having that answer, because the object was not preserved or cannot be identified, is one of the genuinely painful aspects of this story. And it is painful in the way that history is painful when it goes wrong. When the person who should have taken notes didn't. When the object that should have been saved was discarded. When the excavation that should have been continued was filled in and built over. When the letter that should have been filed in the right place ended up in the wrong box. The 1832 discovery is a story about all the ways that the past can be lost, not through malice, but through the ordinary indifference of people who do not yet know that what they are handling is irreplaceable. We do things differently now in principle. Professional archaeology has standards of documentation, preservation, and reporting that would, in an ideal world, prevent the kind of loss that characterized the 1832 discovery. In practice, the gap between the ideal and the reality of how archaeological findings are handled remains significant, particularly in the context of urban development, where the pressure of schedules and budgets often works against thorough documentation. But the conceptual framework has shifted. We understand now in ways that people in 1832 did not, that the past is a non-renewable resource, that what is destroyed in the process of making the present cannot be recovered, that the stories buried under our cities are as important, in their way, as the stories we choose to put in our museums, and we understand that the choice of which stories to pursue and which to let go is not a neutral technical decision. It is a political and ethical one with consequences for who gets to belong to the history and who gets left out of it. The 1832 discovery is not the only anomalous finding from the Quebec City area that has failed to receive adequate follow-up. There are others, documented in scattered archaeological reports and antiquarian literature, that suggest the pre-contact history of the region is considerably more complex than the standard narrative allows. The Pointe aux Trembles site, to the northeast of the historic core, has yielded artifacts in contexts that archaeologists have found difficult to reconcile with existing models of indigenous land use in the region. The exact nature of the difficulty varies depending on which report you consult, but the consistent theme is that something about the site does not fit neatly into the expected pattern. The Ile d'Orléans, the island in the St. Lawrence just downstream from Quebec City, has been occupied since deep in pre-contact time, and the archaeological work that has been done there has produced results that are quietly anomalous in ways that have not been resolved. One 1990s excavation report describes ceramic material whose technological tradition cannot be readily assigned to any known regional tradition, which is archaeologist language for, "We don't know where this came from." The Beaupré coast, along the north shore of the St. Lawrence east of the city, contains numerous sites that have been surveyed but not extensively excavated, and the survey results suggest occupation sequences that are longer and more complex than the existing literature would predict. Each of these individual anomalies might have a prosaic explanation. Taken together, they form a pattern suggesting that the pre-contact history of the Quebec City region is not well understood, and that the apparent absence of complexity in that history reflects the limitations of investigation rather than the actual character of the past. This is not a comfortable conclusion for the institutional archaeology of Quebec, which has produced a substantial and valuable body of work on the region's past, and which understandably does not relish the suggestion that its conclusions are significantly incomplete. But the discomfort of institutional establishments with the implications of their own incomplete record is not a reason to avoid pursuing the record further. The 1832 discovery, if it was genuine, was not an isolated anomaly in a well-understood landscape. It was one data point in a region whose deep past is less well understood than the volume of archaeological work conducted there might suggest. This context makes it less implausible, not more. In a region where the standard story is known to be incomplete, a discovery that does not fit the standard story is less surprising than it would be in a region where the archaeology is well resolved. Quebec City is, in the most literal physical sense, built on its past. The stones that Champlain cut are still in the walls of the fortifications. The foundations of the first French buildings are still in the ground beneath their successors. The material traces of 3 centuries of colonial history are everywhere underfoot, compressed into the substrate of the living city. And beneath all of that, before the French, before the contact period, before the disappearance of the St. Lawrence Iroquoians, before Cartier's first visit in 1534, before any European eye had rested on the Cape of Diamond, people were living, working, building, and leaving traces in the earth. Some of those traces have been found and documented, others have not, and some, perhaps, have been found and then covered again, their significance unrecognized or unacknowledged. The story that began in 1832 with a pickaxe striking stone in a construction trench in the lower town is still unfinished. The stones are still down there if they survive the subsequent century and a half of urban development. The documents that might explain them are still out there, in some form, in some archive, waiting for the right search to find them. The objects that were recovered and then lost are perhaps sitting uncatalogued in a storeroom somewhere, waiting for someone to recognize what they are. None of this is certain. Much of it may be wishful thinking, the very human desire to find mystery where there is only loss. But the persistent, multi-generational refusal of this story to die completely is itself a kind of evidence, not of the discovery's reality, but of its significance. Stories that have no substance do not survive 2 centuries of institutional indifference. They disappear. The 1832 discovery has not disappeared. It has gone underground, which is perhaps the most appropriate fate for a story about something that was underground to begin with. There is a generation of researchers coming up in Canadian archaeology and history who are approaching the pre-contact past with tools and conceptual frameworks that were not available to their predecessors. LiDAR surveys revealing landscape features invisible from the ground. Ancient DNA analysis revealing population histories invisible in the skeletal record. Isotope analysis tracing the movements of individuals across vast distances. Computational methods for analyzing large archival collections that would take lifetimes to read by hand. These tools are changing what is possible to know about the deep past, and they are changing it rapidly. In this environment, revisiting the 1832 discovery is not the act of romantic antiquarianism it might have seemed in the 1960s or 1970s. It is a reasonable application of new methodological possibilities to an old unsolved problem. The archival question, whether the documentary record of the discovery can be more fully reconstructed, is tractable with modern computational archival methods applied to the colonial correspondence collections that have not been systematically searched. The physical question, whether the subsurface features described in 1832 and again in the 1980s can be detected and characterized without excavation, is tractable with modern geophysical survey techniques. The object question, whether material from the discovery ended up in institutional collections and can be identified there, is tractable with the kind of systematic collection review that museum digitization projects are beginning to make possible. None of these approaches guarantees a result. The documents may be gone beyond recovery. The features may have been destroyed by subsequent construction. The objects may have been discarded in the 19th century and exist nowhere. But the failure to find anything would itself be informative. Negative results in a systematic search tell you something about the limits of the record. They narrow the space of possibilities. They are not wasted effort. And the possibility of a positive result, of finding the letter that explains what was found, of detecting the anomalous stone features with a geophysical survey, of identifying an uncatalogued ceramic fragment from a Quebec City collection that doesn't match any known regional tradition, is not negligible. It is real enough to be worth pursuing. Quebec City has been the capital of New France, a British garrison town, the capital of the province of Canada, and a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It has been a place of war, diplomacy, commerce, and culture. Its history is documented in extraordinary detail from the moment of French contact onward. Before that contact, there is relative silence. Not the silence of emptiness, because the evidence for pre-contact occupation is abundant, but the silence of incomprehension, because the tools and the will to hear what the pre-contact past is saying have not always been present. In 1832, a group of workers and their supervisors heard something. They tried to report it, and then the city closed over the sound, and the silence returned. It may not be too late to hear it again. The Cape of Diamond is ancient. The river is ancient. The landscape was here long before any of the stories we tell about it, and the evidence of the lives that were lived in it, built into it, buried under it, is patient in the way that stone is patient. It will wait. The question is whether we will stop to listen before the last traces are gone, buried beyond the reach of any survey under the weight of the present pressing down on the past, or whether the stones of 1832 will wait another 2 centuries for someone to think. The question is worth asking. The St. Lawrence River doesn't answer questions. It simply flows, as it has always flowed, past the Cape of Diamond, past the site of the lower town, past the place where workers once stopped and looked at what their picks had struck and wrote letters that were mostly lost, carrying all its secrets in the direction of the sea. But rivers carry things. They also reveal them. When the water is low, when the light is right, when someone is looking with the right kind of eyes, Quebec City is still there, the Cape is still there, and somewhere beneath the cobblestones and the heritage plaques and the centuries of accumulated human habitation, the mystery of 1832 is still there too. Waiting, there is a man named Thomas Lowell, whose name appears in exactly one surviving document related to the 1832 discovery. He is identified in that document, a marginal annotation in a bound compilation of colonial correspondence that was accessioned by a Montreal archive in the 1920s as a foreman of works employed in the lower town excavations. His name appears alongside a phrase that reads, in the cramped and faded handwriting of a 19th century annotation, was said to have preserved some portion of what was found. The annotation's author is not identified. The date of the annotation is not given. And Thomas Lowell, foreman of works, does not appear in any other document that researchers have been able to identify, but he was there. He was at the excavation in 1832. He was close enough to what was found to preserve some portion of it. And someone, at some later point, thought that fact was worth noting in the margin of a compiled document, which suggests that Thomas Lowell was, at some level, part of the story that was trying not to be lost. Where did what he preserved go? The annotation gives no clue. Lowell himself is not traceable through birth, marriage, death, or census records in the colonial Quebec administrative files that have been searched. He may have been a recent immigrant whose documentation is in British records rather than Canadian ones. He may have been a transient worker whose paper trail was never extensive. He may have had descendants in Quebec or elsewhere whose family holdings might contain what he preserved, if it survived that long. The possibility that physical material from the 1832 discovery is sitting in someone's attic or basement, unrecognized for what it is not as far-fetched as it might seem. Private collections of old things accumulated by Victorian-era tradesmen and passed down through families without documentation are a recognized category in the world of historical material culture. Objects lose their context when the person who knew the context dies without passing that knowledge along. A ceramic fragment, a piece of worked stone, an unusual metal object could easily spend a century and a half as an unidentified curiosity in a family collection before someone thought to have it examined. The Lowell annotation is the kind of detail that makes the 1832 discovery so frustrating. It points toward a trail that cannot currently be followed because the man at the end of it is too poorly documented to trace. But it also suggests that the story was not as invisible to contemporaries as the thinness of the surviving record might imply. Someone knew about Lowell. Someone thought his preservation of artifacts was worth recording. There was a community of people in 19th century Quebec who were aware of the discovery and who were, in their small way, trying to make sure that something of it survived. That community is now gone. But the things they tried to preserve may not be. The great unsaid of the 1832 story, the thing that hovers beneath the surface of all the diplomatic caution in the historical accounts that do exist, is the question of what it would mean if the foundations were genuine and pre-colonial. Not the technical archaeological meaning, not the cultural affiliation and the dating and the material analysis, but the political and existential meaning. What would it mean for the history of Canada, for the history of Quebec, for the relationship between Indigenous and settler communities, for the legal and political frameworks that have governed land claims and sovereignty in North America, if there were evidence of a complex pre-colonial civilization in one of the most symbolically important sites in Canadian history? The answer is complicated, and the complication is not separate from the reason the story has been so effectively buried. History is not just a record of the past. It is a resource that the present uses to justify itself. The history of who was where, first, of who built what, of whose civilization is primary and whose is derivative, matters enormously to the legal and political structures that determine who has rights and whose rights are secondary. In the specific context of Quebec City, the question of pre-colonial history intersects with multiple layers of contested identity. The French colonial claim, the British colonial claim, the Indigenous claim that precedes both, and the specifically Quebecois national claim, which has its own complicated relationship with both the French colonial past and the Indigenous presence that predates it. Into this already layered complexity, a discovery of pre-colonial architecture of uncertain origin does not fit neatly. It does not straightforwardly support any one of the existing claims. It complicates all of them. And the complication, depending on how the discovery was ultimately interpreted, could potentially have legal implications for land rights, for the terms of existing treaties, for the entire juridical framework governing the relationship between the Canadian state and Indigenous nations. These implications were not fully articulate in 1832 in the way they would be today, because the legal frameworks and the political consciousness that make them articulable had not yet fully developed. But the instinct that the discovery was uncomfortable, that it was the kind of thing that was better left alone, was almost certainly present. Powerful institutions do not need to have a fully worked out legal theory of why a discovery is inconvenient. They only need to sense that it is, and the path of least resistance takes care of the rest. Today, the implications are more clearly visible. The truth and reconciliation process in Canada has shifted the ground of historical reckoning in ways that make the suppression of Indigenous and pre-colonial history more politically visible and more morally charged. The ongoing process of land claims adjudication has made the question of pre-colonial occupation of specific sites a matter of live legal interest rather than merely academic curiosity. And the broader shift in public consciousness around colonial history, around whose stories have been told and whose have been silenced, creates a context in which the 1832 discovery and its subsequent disappearance is more legible as a story about power than it might have been in previous generations. This does not mean that the discovery was definitely what the most dramatic interpretations suggest. It does not mean that what was found under Quebec City in 1832 was unambiguously pre-colonial, or that it represented a lost civilization that rewrites North American history. The evidence does not support those conclusions because the evidence is too fragmentary. What the current political and social context does mean is that the question is worth asking with more seriousness than it has previously received, and that the institutional reluctance to ask it can no longer be entirely explained by technical and evidential considerations alone. The reluctance has a political dimension that is now more visible than it once was. The city of Quebec, the province of Quebec, and the government of Canada all have an interest in this question that goes beyond historical curiosity. If the foundations found in 1832 were genuine pre-colonial architecture, and if they could be conclusively established as such, that would have implications for how the site is understood in the context of Indigenous land rights. It would have implications for heritage designation and management. It would have implications for the national narrative, which uses Quebec City's centuries-old history as one of its foundational symbols. None of these implications is straightforwardly negative. A richer, more complex, more honestly told history of the site could ultimately serve the interests of reconciliation better than the current, simplified story. But getting to that richer history requires a willingness to sit with uncertainty, to acknowledge gaps, to invest resources in questions whose answers might be uncomfortable, and to follow the evidence wherever it leads rather than only where institutional comfort permits. This is, always, the hard part of history, not the finding of evidence, but the decision to look. The discovery of 1832 is a small story in some ways. One excavation in one city, a handful of letters, a few decades of antiquarian footnotes, a retired archaeologist's careful recollections, none of it dramatic, none of it conclusive. But small stories can carry large meanings. And the story of what was found beneath Quebec City and what was done with it is a story about the relationship between knowledge and power that is as relevant now as it was then. The river keeps flowing. The stones keep waiting. And the silence beneath the city of Quebec is both the silence of loss and the silence of possibility. It will take someone willing to listen to know which one it is. There is a final dimension to this story that has not yet been addressed, and it is perhaps the most human one. The dimension of curiosity itself, of the people across 2 centuries who encountered this story and found they could not entirely let it go, who put notes in margins, who compiled antiquarian volumes, who wrote memos that went nowhere, who spoke to journalists about anomalous field reports, who spent retirement thinking about what they saw in a construction trench in the lower town. These people were not cranks, at least not mostly. They were ordinary people who encountered something that didn't fit, and who felt the ordinary human obligation to notice that it didn't fit, to say so, and to hope that someone else would follow up. They were the custodians of a question that the institutions would not hold. This is its own kind of historical record, not a record of what was under the ground in 1832, but a record of what happens when ordinary people encounter evidence that makes them uncomfortable and choose, against the path of least resistance, to remember it and pass it along. The story of the 1832 discovery is partly a story about institutional failure. It is also a story about the persistence of human curiosity in the face of that failure, and about the way that questions too important to die find their way through cracks in the wall of official silence into the next generation. Quebec City is old, but the earth beneath it is older, and what the earth holds, it holds until someone thinks to ask for it back. The asking has barely begun. There is another angle to this mystery that deserves full consideration, one that the conventional history of Eastern Canada has systematically avoided. The Phoenician hypothesis. This is where many researchers stop reading. The Phoenician hypothesis, the idea that seafarers from the ancient Levant crossed the Atlantic and made contact with North America in antiquity, is associated in most academic minds with the worst excesses of fringe archaeology, with the kind of wishful thinking that produces Bat Creek inscriptions and Newport towers and elaborate theories that tell us more about the anxieties of their proponents than about the actual past. The association is not entirely unfair. The hypothesis has attracted its share of enthusiasts who have seen Phoenician writing on every scratched rock and Canaanite influence in every indigenous cultural practice that seemed to them exotic. But the hypothesis has also attracted serious researchers who have approached it with genuine methodological rigor, and their work deserves consideration even where it remains controversial. The Phoenicians were, by any measure, the most extraordinary maritime civilization of the ancient world. Operating from city-states along the coast of modern Lebanon and Israel, from roughly 1500 BCE to 300 BCE, They built a trading empire that stretched from the eastern Mediterranean to the Atlantic coast of West Africa and Spain. They circumnavigated Africa, according to Herodotus, at the behest of the Egyptian pharaoh Necho II. They founded Carthage, which would become one of the most significant cities of the ancient world, and they pushed steadily westward into the Atlantic, establishing colonies in the Canary Islands and along the Moroccan coast that brought them within reach of the transatlantic current systems that connect the Old World to the New. The question of whether Phoenician mariners ever made use of those current systems to reach the Americas is one that mainstream scholarship considers settled in the negative. The evidence, in the mainstream view, is simply not there. But the minority view, held by a small number of serious researchers, is that the evidence has not been adequately searched for, and that what evidence exists has been systematically undervalued. The argument rests on several categories of evidence. Linguistic evidence, in the form of possible cognates between ancient Semitic languages and certain indigenous American languages, is the weakest because the methodology for establishing such connections is contested and the results are easily influenced by confirmation bias. Genetic evidence in the form of mitochondrial haplogroups and Y chromosome lineages found in certain indigenous American populations that have affinities to Near Eastern populations is more interesting but still contested because the precise origins and migration routes of these lineages are not definitively established. Physical evidence in the form of objects and inscriptions found at various sites in the Americas that have been interpreted as Phoenician or related Semitic in character is the most direct, but also the most susceptible to misidentification and forgery. The Quebec City context is relevant here because of geography. The mouth of the St. Lawrence is one of the most accessible points on the eastern seaboard of North America from the perspective of a transatlantic voyage following the northern current systems. A vessel leaving the Iberian coast or the North African coast, whether Phoenician, Carthaginian, or from a later Mediterranean tradition, following the currents that Norse sailors would eventually learn to use, would find the Gulf of St. Lawrence a natural landfall. The St. Lawrence River, once entered, would be an irresistible invitation to exploration. This is not evidence that Phoenician or Carthaginian sailors reached Quebec City. It is geographical plausibility. Plausibility is not proof, but plausibility, combined with the specific character of the anomalous construction described in 1832, combined with the broader pattern of unresolved pre-contact mysteries in the region, is enough to keep the question open. The construction technique described in the 1832 accounts, large fitted stones, tight joints, geometric markings, no mortar of the European colonial type, is more consistent with Old World stone building traditions than with the known construction traditions of pre-contact northeastern North America. This does not mean it was Old World. It means it was not obviously any of the things it should have been if the standard history of the region is complete. Absence of fit is not positive identification, but it is a door that the standard narrative cannot close without examination. The geometric markings are particularly interesting. Incised patterns on work stone are among the most culturally specific forms of material culture that archaeology deals with. Stonecutters in any tradition leave marks that reflect their training, their tools, their cultural conventions about the significance and form of symbolic expression. A geometric pattern on a dressed stone block can, if the pattern is distinctive enough and the comparanda are well established, be attributed to a cultural tradition with considerable confidence. The problem is that the description of the markings in the 1832 accounts is too vague to support any specific attribution. Symbolic markings that reminded the observer of ancient Mediterranean ruins is not archaeological description. It is the impression of an educated colonial who had read about ancient civilizations but had no direct training in recognizing them. He might have been seeing something genuinely analogous to ancient Mediterranean stonework. He might have been seeing indigenous geometric motifs that his education had primed him to read as Mediterranean. He might have been seeing the incidental scoring of tool marks in a pattern that his pattern-seeking brain organized into apparent intentionality. Without photographs, without drawings, without the stones themselves, there is no way to say which of these possibilities is closest to the truth, and this is the deepest frustration of the 1832 story. Not the loss of the interpretation, which would always have been contested, but the loss of the data, the loss of the thing itself. The stones, the ceramics, the metal object are the irreplaceable evidence. Everything else, the letters, the compiled accounts, the antiquarian footnotes, is commentary on something that can no longer be directly examined. The commentary is all we have. And commentary without its subject is like a transcript without a recording. You can read the words, but you cannot hear the voice. In the winter of 1998, a municipal worker doing maintenance on a storm drain in Quebec City's lower town encountered at approximately 2 meters below the current street surface a section of stone wall that he described to his supervisor as definitely old, not like anything I've seen in the drainage work. His supervisor noted the observation, filed a brief report with the city's Heritage Office, and the Heritage Office sent a representative who examined the area and concluded that the wall was likely associated with early colonial construction, not inconsistent with the known building history of the area. That assessment may well be correct. Likely and not inconsistent are the qualified language of an expert making a preliminary judgment, without the time or resources to investigate thoroughly. The assessment closed the administrative file. The drainage work was completed. The wall, whatever it was sealed back in. The 1998 incident does not appear in any published archaeological record. It exists only in the municipal file system, where it was reported to a researcher by a city official who was reviewing maintenance records for an unrelated project and stumbled across the notation. The researcher found it notable enough to mention in a conference paper on urban archaeology in Quebec City that was presented in 2003 and published in a minor regional journal. The 2003 paper did not attract significant attention. Conference papers in minor regional journals rarely do. It sits in a library database somewhere, technically accessible, practically invisible. This is the fractal structure of the 1832 mystery. Each attempt to investigate it produces a small result that points toward more investigation, which is never funded, which produces another small result that points toward more investigation, which is never funded. The mystery does not grow or shrink. It simply persists at the same level of incompleteness, accumulating new layers of reference and annotation that circle the same unanswered core. Round and round the evidence goes, and the center of it remains as opaque as the earth that holds whatever is down there. The city of Quebec has in recent years invested significantly in archaeological work as part of its heritage management strategy. This work has been productive and has expanded our understanding of the colonial era city substantially. What it has not done, with any systematic intention, is focus on the pre-contact layers that underlie the colonial occupation. This is partly a matter of research priority and partly a matter of the practical challenges of investigating pre-contact deposits in an intensively occupied urban area. But partly it reflects a choice about what questions are worth asking and which are better left dormant. The pre-contact history of Quebec City is, in institutional terms, a sensitive subject. The intersection of indigenous land rights, colonial heritage, and national identity that converges at the site of the old city makes it a place where unexpected archaeological results would have implications well beyond the academic. The institutional incentive is not to find things that would require difficult conversations. This incentive is understandable. It is also corrosive. History that is managed for institutional comfort rather than investigated for truth is not history. It is mythology with an archaeological veneer. And mythology, however comfortable, does not serve the long-term interests of any of the parties whose histories are at stake in Quebec City's soil. The indigenous nations whose ancestors lived in and around the site of modern Quebec City for thousands of years before Champlain arrived have a stake in the pre-contact history of the area. The Quebec national identity, which derives part of its depth from the ancient character of the city and the region, has a stake in that history. The Canadian state, which is in the process of reckoning with its colonial past, has a stake in it, and the broader community of people interested in the deep human past of North America, who are watching as the standard narrative is revised in real time by new evidence from multiple directions, has a stake in it. All of these stakes point in the same direction, toward investigation, toward honesty, toward the willingness to look at what is there and report what is found, even if what is found does not fit the existing story. The 1832 discovery may ultimately turn out to be exactly what the cautious institutional assessment would suggest: colonial construction misidentified by observers without archaeological training, given a mystery narrative by the romantic impulses of Victorian antiquarianism, and then kept alive by the human appetite for stories that challenge comfortable assumptions. This is a possible outcome, and it should be taken seriously. But it is not the only possible outcome, and the fact that it has been treated, in practice, as the only outcome worth entertaining, without the investigation that would be needed to establish it, is itself a kind of failure, a failure of institutional nerve, a failure of historical imagination, a failure, ultimately, of the obligation that those who have access to evidence and resources owe to the questions that evidence and resources could answer. Quebec City holds its past the way all old cities hold their past, imperfectly, incompletely, with great gaps in the record and great uncertainty about what the gaps conceal. This is not unusual. What is unusual is the specific character of one particular gap, the gap that opened in 1832 when a discovery was made and then covered over, and that has persisted for 2 centuries in the margins of the city's official self-understanding. The gap is not empty. It is full of questions, full of the whispers of workers who struck stone where there should have been earth, of scholars who wrote letters that were not kept, of antiquarians who noted what they could not explain, of archaeologists who filed reports that were not followed up, of a historian whose uncatalogued papers sit in a university archive, of a retired field archaeologist who still wonders what she saw. The gap is full of the sound of the St. Lawrence running past the Cape of Diamond as it has always run, indifferent to the stories that human beings tell about what they found and lost and found again on its banks. What was found in 1832 may be gone. The site may be destroyed. The objects may have long since become unidentifiable. The primary documents may be irretrievably lost. This is possible, and if it is true, then the mystery of Quebec City's buried stones will remain a mystery, permanently unresolved, permanently haunting the margins of the city's history. But it is also possible that the story is not over, that the right search of the right archive will turn up the letter that changes everything, that a geophysical survey of the lower town will detect features that match the 1832 descriptions and can be targeted for excavation, that somewhere in a museum storeroom or a family attic is the object that Thomas Lowell, foreman of works, was said to have preserved, that the story that has been waiting underground for 2 centuries is waiting to be told above ground, in daylight, with the full weight of evidence that it deserves. The possibility is real. The willingness to take it seriously is the only thing that has ever been lacking. Quebec City waits. The Cape of Diamond waits. The river runs and the seasons turn, and the stones, if they are there, wait in their ancient patience for the day that the present decides the past is worth knowing. That day is a choice. It is always a choice. And the choice, in this case, as in all cases where buried history is concerned, belongs to those of us who are here now, in the light above the ground, asking questions that the earth has been waiting to answer. There is a season in Quebec City that few travelers ever see. Not the brilliant autumn, with its riot of maples turning the Laurentian hillsides into something almost unreal in its beauty. Not the famous winter, brutal and clarifying, when the St. Lawrence freezes at its edges and the city hunkers into its stone foundations against the cold. Not the brief, ecstatic summer, when the terraces fill and the old city becomes almost absurdly picturesque in the long northern light. The season, I mean, is the shoulder of early spring, when the river ice breaks up and the water runs dark and fast between the shores, carrying the winter's accumulated weight toward the sea. When the snow has pulled back from the Cape of Diamond, but the ground is still saturated, still soft, still yielding to the pressure of feet, in a way the frozen winter ground never does. When you can walk the lower town in the early morning before the tourists arrive, and the city is quiet in a way that feels ancient, as if the cobblestones are remembering something older than themselves. It is in this season that the sense of what lies beneath is most acute. The ground is soft, the earth is close, the boundary between the surface world and whatever is below it feels permeable in a way it does not feel in summer or winter, and the river, running high and fast with snowmelt, sounds like it is saying something urgent in a language that the city has mostly forgotten how to hear. In this season, if you stand in the right place in the lower town, at the right angle to the cliff and the river, you can feel the age of the site in a way that the heritage plaques and the tourism infrastructure normally obscure. You can feel that people have been standing in this spot, looking at this river, for a very long time, for longer perhaps than the official history of the city acknowledges, for long enough that the stone beneath your feet has been worn not just by French and British footsteps, but by others, older, whose names and languages and purposes are not recorded anywhere except perhaps in the earth itself. This is not mysticism. It is a form of historical imagination that the evidence warrants. The Cape of Diamond was strategically significant before Champlain, before Cartier, before the first European eye rested on it. The people who were here before understood what it was. They used it. They may have built on it. And the question of what they built, and when, and what happened to it, is a question that the earth has been holding in patience for the investigators who have not yet arrived. The workers who found the stones in 1832 were those investigators, however unprepared they were for the role. They did what they could with what they had, which was not much. They looked, they reported. They waited for someone with more authority and more knowledge to tell them what they were looking at. No one with sufficient authority and knowledge came in time. But the question did not die with the opportunity. It has been waiting, like the stones themselves, for the right moment and the right person and the right combination of institutional will and technical capacity to bring it back into the light. Whether that moment comes, and whether the story that emerges from the earth is the story of a genuine pre-colonial mystery, or the story of a colonial construction misidentified by overexcited antiquarians, is something we do not yet know. What we know is that the question is real, that it has been insufficiently examined, and that the examination it deserves is technically possible with the tools and methods that exist today. The rest is a matter of choice, and choices about what history to pursue are not neutral. They reflect what we value and who we think matters, and whose past we are willing to take seriously enough to invest in recovering. Quebec City's stones are waiting for that valuing, for that seriousness, for the willingness to go down into the dark and see what is there and report it honestly, regardless of what it turns out to be. The river flows, the cape stands, the silence persists, and beneath the cobblestones of the lower town, the answer to the question of 1832 waits, patient as only stone can be patient, for the day when someone finally decides the question is worth the asking. Until then, the mystery remains, as it has remained for nearly 2 centuries. Written in the earth below one of the oldest cities in North America, unread, unreached, and stubbornly, persistently real. The stones know what was there. If we want to know too, we have only to ask. Let us look closely at what Quebec City became in the decades after 1832, because the transformation of the city in the 19th century is inseparable from the transformation of its relationship to its own history. The rebellions of 1837 and 1838 changed everything. The political crisis that had been building in Lower Canada for years erupted into open armed conflict, and the British colonial government's response was swift and decisive and transformative. Lord Durham's report, commissioned in the aftermath of the rebellions, recommended the union of Upper and Lower Canada and the gradual assimilation of French-Canadian culture into English-speaking North America. The Act of Union of 1840 implemented this recommendation, and Quebec City, which had been the capital of a predominantly French-speaking colony, became instead the seat of a government explicitly designed to dilute French cultural and political power. In this context, the history of the city became a contested resource. French-Canadian intellectuals and clergy, fighting to preserve a distinct cultural identity against the assimilationist pressure of the Union, leaned heavily on history, specifically on the narrative of French primacy in North America, of a civilization planted in the wilderness of the New World 2 centuries before. The founding of New France, the establishment of Quebec City, the extraordinary achievement of building a European civilization in the northern forest, these became the pillars of a cultural identity under siege. Into this fraught context, the 1832 discovery fit extremely badly. A finding that suggested the site of Quebec City had been occupied by a sophisticated culture before the French arrived was not a finding that the defenders of French-Canadian cultural primacy in North America had any interest in amplifying. The French had built Quebec City. That was the story that mattered. Everything before the French was in this cultural calculus, prehistory, the undifferentiated wilderness out of which New France had carved itself. The indigenous peoples who had actually been there were acknowledged to exist, but their role in the standard cultural narrative was as context, as background, as the wilderness the French had navigated and converted and sometimes fought. Not as builders, not as people with their own deep history of occupation and culture on the very site where the French now stood. A discovery of pre-colonial architecture complicated this narrative at the level of physical reality. It suggested that the land on which New France stood had already been marked by human intelligence, by human construction, by human achievement before the French arrived. This was not a comfortable suggestion for a cultural identity built on the story of civilization brought to wilderness. The British colonial administration had its own reasons for not pursuing the discovery. The British story of North America also depended, in various ways, on the idea of the continent as raw material for European civilization. A pre-colonial culture capable of building in stone was a complicating factor in a narrative that served to justify the entire colonial enterprise. And the Church, which wielded enormous cultural and educational authority in Lower Canada throughout the 19th century, had theological as well as political reasons to prefer the standard narrative. Biblical chronology and the history of human civilization, as the Church understood it, left limited room for the kind of pre-contact complexity that the 1832 discovery implied. Three dominant institutional forces, the French-Canadian nationalist cultural movement, the British colonial administration, and the Roman Catholic Church, all had reasons to let the 1832 discovery fade. None of them needed to explicitly suppress it. The shared interest in not pursuing it was sufficient, and in an environment where those three forces between them controlled most of the channels through which historical knowledge was produced and preserved, the silence that followed was effectively complete. The subsequent history of the city reinforced and deepened that silence. The heritage preservation movement that developed in the 20th century was built around the story of colonial Quebec, of the French and then British layers of civilization that gave the city its extraordinary character as a preserved historic urban landscape. The designation of the Old City as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1985 celebrated that colonial heritage and gave institutional weight to the narrative of Quebec City as a monument to European civilization in North America. This designation is not wrong. The colonial heritage of Quebec City is genuinely extraordinary and genuinely worth preserving. But the heritage framework that grew up around that colonial history had no conceptual place for the pre-colonial history that might lie beneath it. The World Heritage designation protects the walls and the churches and the streets and the colonial streetscapes. It does not protect or even acknowledge whatever might be below those layers. This is not unusual in the global heritage system. The UNESCO World Heritage Framework, developed in the 1970s and refined since, has historically privileged the visible built heritage of relatively recent periods over the invisible buried heritage of deeper time. The framework is now being revised, slowly, to give more weight to intangible heritage and to the historical depth that lies beneath the surface of many heritage sites. But the revision has not yet fundamentally changed the situation at Quebec City. The stones of 1832 are not recognized. They are not protected. They are not even officially acknowledged to exist. They are the heritage beneath the heritage, the history under the history, the story that falls outside the frame of what the official narrative has space to include. And this is ultimately what makes the 1832 discovery more than a historical curiosity. It is a test case for the limits of the heritage framework and the historical imagination that underpins it. It asks whether we are willing to extend our curiosity and our institutional resources to the parts of the past that do not fit neatly into our existing stories, whether we are willing to invest in questions whose answers might require us to revise those stories, whether we are willing to honor the depth of human presence in North America, not just where it is comfortable to do so, but where the evidence points, regardless of how it disturbs the narratives we have built. These are questions that apply well beyond Quebec City. They apply to every site in the Americas where the standard account of pre-contact history is incomplete or contested. They apply to the thousands of sites that have not been excavated, to the objects that have not been analyzed, to the oral traditions that have not been taken seriously, to the anomalous findings that have been noted and filed and forgotten. They apply most urgently to the period of transition around the end of the last ice age, when human occupation of the Americas was being established in ways that we are only beginning to understand, and when the complexity of what was already here when the Europeans arrived was vastly greater than the colonial narrative ever acknowledged. Quebec City is not Cahokia. It is not Chichen Itza. It is not the kind of site that draws continental archaeological attention to its pre-contact layers. It is a colonial city fundamentally in its character and its self-understanding. But it sits on ground that was old before the French arrived, and the depth of that ground's human history is a question that has been asked without being answered for 2 centuries. The asking is the beginning. The investigation that should follow the asking is the responsibility of the present to the past and to the future. Whatever is under the cobblestones of the lower town, it deserves to be known. Whatever the workers struck in 1832, it deserved to be preserved and understood. Whatever Thomas Lowell, foreman of works, saved and carried away from that excavation deserves to be identified and returned to the light. The gap in the record is a wound in the history, and wounds do not heal by being ignored. They heal by being examined, cleaned, and treated with the care that the knowledge of what was lost demands. Quebec City's wound is 2 centuries old. It has been long enough. The time to look is now. The method to look with exists. The only thing remaining is the will. And perhaps, someday soon, in the early morning of an early spring, when the river is running high and the lower town is quiet and the Cape of Diamond is visible against the pale sky, someone will begin the systematic search that should have begun in 1832, when the workers stopped their picks and called for their supervisors and tried to tell a story that the world was not ready to hear. That story is waiting. The stones are waiting. The river is waiting. The silence beneath the old city of Quebec is waiting. And the only question left is whether we are finally ready to listen. One final thought before the silence returns. There is a phrase that appears in the letter of a colonial surveyor copied into the 1860s compilation that has stayed with everyone who has come across it. The compiler quotes the surveyor directly in a passage he apparently found too striking to paraphrase. The stones are fitted as though the builder knew they would have to last, not as a man builds who expects to return and repair, but as a man builds who knows he will not see this place again and wants what he makes to outlast his knowledge of having made it. The surveyor was trying to describe the quality of the construction he was looking at, the tightness of the joints, the deliberateness of the fitting, the sense that whoever had built these walls had built them with an awareness of time, with an understanding that what they were constructing would need to endure beyond their own presence. There is something in that observation that cuts through the historical confusion and the institutional indifference and the scholarly caution and the political complications. The builder built to last. The builder understood that what they were making was permanent, was meant to outlast the moment of its making, was meant to be found by whoever came after. In a sense, that is what happened. The walls were found in 1832 by workers who had no idea what they were looking at, and then again, in fragments, by every person who has come across the story in the century and a half since, and found themselves unable to fully let it go. The builder built to be found. The question is whether we are finally ready to find them. The mystery of 1832 is not a closed case. It is an open question documented in fragments, pointing towards something real, waiting for the investigation that has not yet been undertaken with the seriousness it deserves. Quebec City waits. The Cape waits. The river waits. The stones, if they are there, wait in the way that stone has always waited, without impatience, without expectation, simply present in the dark beneath the present, holding their secret in the patience of material that outlasts everything built above it. The discovery of 1832 was a beginning that was never allowed to become a story. That story is still waiting to be told. The history of North America is not the history that was written down. It is the history that was lived and built and buried by every people who ever stood on this land and looked at the river and the sky and the stone and decided this was where they would make their mark. Most of those marks are invisible now. Most of those lives are unrecorded. Most of those builders are unknown, but the marks are there. The lives left traces. The builders built to last. And the earth, which has been holding all of that patient, as it has always been patient, is waiting for the day we decide we want to know what it knows. Quebec City is a beginning. What lies beneath it is a question. And the question, 2 centuries old and still unanswered, is more alive today than it has ever been. The mystery of 1832 is not over. It is only waiting. Listen to the river. Listen to the silence beneath the city. Listen to the stones that have been waiting since long before anyone thought to ask what they were, for the voice that finally says, I found you. I know you are there, and I am not going to bury you again. That voice, when it comes, will change everything. Again. And that is exactly the kind of change that the stones of 1832 were always asking us to